At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law grabbed a fistful of earth and hurled it into my face, hissing, "Your place is in that grave right beside him, you old witch." My son turned away. I silently wiped the dirt from my face and watched calmly as the coffin was lowered into the ground. They didn't know that I had already carried out my husband's final wish. And when the attorney arrived at their door 1 week later, the horror on their faces was something I will never forget. But before you hear what was in that will, I ask you to support my story. If you know the feeling of betrayal, if you've ever hungered for justice, like and subscribe. Sit back and listen. It all began the day my Elijah went silent. The quiet that fell over our old home in Atlanta's Sweet Auburn neighborhood was deafening. For 60 years we had lived as one soul. He was a brilliant jeweler, a man whose hands could make a stone speak. I was his faithful partner, a gemologist, the only person alive who could tell a real diamond from the finest imitation at a single glance. Our home was more than a house. It was our fortress, our workshop, our whole world. The ground floor belonged to his sanctuary, the studio with its tools, its casting furnace, and the enormous safe where he kept his treasures. Elijah left quietly, in his sleep. Heart failure, the doctor said. He had been sick for much of the last year, but he never let go of his loop or his graver until the very end. "Stones are alive, Dorothy," he used to tell me. "They don't like being abandoned." The first person I called was our son, Marcus. He arrived 2 hours later with Tanisha. I was waiting for an embrace, for words of comfort. What I received was something else entirely. "Mom, we're so sorry," Marcus said, giving me an awkward pat on the shoulder. He smelled of expensive cologne and some unfamiliar business urgency. Tanisha hugged me, but her arms were cold as ice. She pulled away almost immediately and swept the room with a quick, appraising look. "It's going to be hard for you alone in such a big house," she said. "Daddy really held everything together." I nodded in silence. I had no strength to speak. I led them to the living room and offered tea. "Mom, there's no time for tea right now," Marcus said, brushing me off. "We need to handle things, the paperwork, the funeral arrangements, and the inheritance. We need to understand how everything stands." I looked at him, at my 48-year-old son, and saw in his eyes not grief, but impatient anticipation. "Marcus, your father just died," I whispered. "I understand," he said quickly, "but life goes on. Tanisha and I have debts, you know. Dad promised he'd help." Elijah had never promised him anything. On the contrary, he had always despised his son's financial recklessness and endless borrowing, but I didn't argue. They stayed no more than an hour. In that time, Tanisha managed to peek into the studio, rattle the safe's handle, and ask where the keys were. "The keys are with the attorney," I told her. "That was Elijah's wish." "Strange," she said, pressing her thin lips together. "Did he really keep secrets from his own son?" As they were leaving, Tanisha lingered in the hallway. "Dorothy, you stay strong. We'll help you. The important thing is that everything is done fairly." Her version of fairly meant everything to us. I understood that with absolute clarity. They didn't see a grieving widow standing before them. They saw an inconvenient obstacle between themselves and my husband's vast estate. When the door closed behind me, I sat down in Elijah's old armchair and shut my eyes. The house was silent, and in that silence I felt for the first time not grief, but a cold, piercing fear. I was alone against 2 hungry predators, and I didn't yet know that the worst was still to come. That evening, sorting through the papers on my husband's desk, I found an envelope written in his hand. "Elijah, open before the funeral. My heart beat fast with dread. The days before the funeral became an endless fog of grief and humiliation. Marcus and Tanisha came every day, not to support me, but to conduct an inventory of what they already considered their property. Tanisha moved through the rooms, opening dresser drawers without asking, rifling through my belongings. "Dorothy, why do you need this old brooch?" she asked, turning in her fingers the modest piece Elijah had made me for our silver anniversary. "It's not fashionable. We could sell it and use the money to get you, say, a good blood pressure monitor." She spoke of caring, but contempt for my world and my values bled through every word. Every object she touched felt desecrated. Marcus was no better. He constantly steered every conversation toward money. "Mom, do you even understand what his collection is worth?" he asked, rubbing his hands together greedily. I looked it up online. Some rough diamonds like his could go for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Tanisha and I could finally pay off all our debts, buy a house on the lake. He spoke of his plans as though Elijah had been buried long ago and the inheritance already divided. My presence didn't trouble him at all. One evening, they brought along a man they introduced as a valuation specialist. "He's just going to look," Tanisha chirped, "so we have a rough picture of the estate's value for the attorney." This appraiser with his darting eyes walked through the studio, clicking his tongue and peering into desk drawers. "Yes," he said, "there's a great deal to catalog and assess here. It'll take time and money." I understood what they were doing. They wanted to show me I couldn't manage without them, that I was a helpless old woman who knew nothing about business, and I'd better hand everything over voluntarily. That evening, after they left, I opened the envelope Elijah had left me. Inside were not one letter, but two. The first was a short, piercing note. "My dearest Dorothy," he wrote in his familiar, slightly unsteady hand. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. Don't cry. We lived a happy life together. I know things will be hard for you now. Our boy, unfortunately, did not grow into the man we hoped to raise. Greed has consumed his soul. And his wife, she is not a woman, she's a hyena in a dress. They will not leave you in peace. They will tear you apart trying to get to my stones. That is why I have thought everything through. I want you to carry out my final wish. This will be our last performance, our last joke at the expense of their greed. Do everything exactly as it says on the second page. Don't be afraid. I am always with you. Your Elijah." Tears blurred my eyes. I pulled out the second page. It was a detailed step-by-step set of instructions. As I read, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Elijah's plan was wild, eccentric, yet at the same time brilliant in its simplicity. He knew their nature better than anyone. He knew that their greed would become their finest trap. I sat with those papers all night. By morning, there was no fear left in me, no doubt, only a cold, ringing resolve. I would carry out his wishes to the last letter. The next day I called Calvin, our old friend and attorney. "Cal, it's Dorothy. Elijah is gone." "Dorothy, sweetheart, you have my deepest condolences." His voice on the other end of the line was full of genuine feeling. "Thank you, Cal. I need to see you. I have Elijah's final wishes in my hands, and we need to discuss certain things before the funeral, confidentially." We met at a small cafe in Sweet Auburn. I handed him Elijah's instructions. He read for a long time, his thick gray eyebrows furrowed. Then he looked up at me. "Well, that's Eli all over. Yes, it's risky, but Lord, it's beautiful. Are you sure you can do this?" "I'm sure," I answered firmly. "I don't have another choice." Calvin nodded. All right, I'm on your side. We'll do this right. These vultures will get exactly what they deserve. Walking home, I felt different. I was no longer a victim. I was the executor of the final wishes of the man I had loved more than life. And I knew he was looking down at me from somewhere above, nodding in approval. The final act of our performance was only beginning, and I was ready to play my part to the end. The preparations for the funeral proceeded under a suffocating cloud of hypocrisy. Marcus and Tanisha bustled about, performing the appearance of activity, but all their so-called help amounted to one thing: controlling expenses. "Mom, why order such an expensive casket?" Marcus said, flipping through the funeral home catalog. "Dad doesn't care anymore, and we're the ones who have to pay for it. Can't we choose something simpler?" "Your father deserves the best," I said flatly. "The casket will be oak as he wished." Elijah had indeed wanted an oak casket, solid, heavy, with brass fittings. It was one of the items in his instructions, and I followed them without deviation. Tanisha, for her part, took it upon herself to organize the repast. "No catering halls," she declared. "Only the best restaurant in the city. We need to invite all of Elijah's partners, his clients. Everyone should see how we honor his memory." I knew she didn't care about his memory. She needed to present herself as the worthy heir of a great jeweler. I didn't argue. I quietly agreed to everything, paying the bills with the money Elijah had thoughtfully set aside for unexpected expenses. They thought this was their victory, that I was broken and pliable. They didn't know that every step they took only confirmed the wisdom of my late husband's plan. The evening before the funeral, when all the preparations were done, I was alone in the house. I went down to the studio. The air was saturated with the familiar smell of rosin, metal, and machine oil. I walked to the great steel safe, turned the familiar combination of numbers. The door yielded with a creak. Inside, resting on velvet cushions, were his greatest treasure, the rough diamonds. Large, cloudy, unassuming at first glance, but I knew the power, the beauty hidden inside every one of those stones. Elijah had been collecting this set his whole life. He called them the Earth's Tears. I took a small travel bag from the safe and began placing the stones inside, one by one, carefully. My hands trembled. I felt like a thief in my own home, but this was Elijah's wish. "The casket must be empty, Dorothy," his instructions read. "They will be burying their hopes, their greed. My stones, my soul, will be with you." When the last diamond lay in the bag, I closed the safe. It was empty. I went upstairs, dressed, took my bag, and left through the back door. Calvin was already waiting in his car by the gate. "Everything ready?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I answered, placing the bag on the back seat. We drove to the bank. There, in a safety deposit box rented in my name, I left Elijah's treasure. Returning home, I felt an enormous sense of relief. The hardest part of the plan had been completed. Now all that remained was to play my role in tomorrow's performance. I thought back to Elijah's final days. He was already very weak, but his mind remained sharp and clear. "They'll come for the stones like crows on carrion," he had said, holding my hand in his. "I don't want them to have a single thing. They didn't value our love, so let them not have our money either. Let their own greed punish them. This will be my last masterpiece, my finest joke." I wept then, begging him not to talk that way, and he only smiled. "Don't cry, Dorothy. Death isn't the end. It's just a passage to another form. My stones will live forever, and so will my love for you. As for them, they are nothing but dust." That evening, I grasped the full depth of his design. This was not simply revenge, it was a lesson, brutal but just, about the things that matter more than money and stones: honor, dignity, love, the very things my son and his wife had been entirely stripped of. And tomorrow they were going to find that out. The day of the funeral was gray and raw. A light, cold rain had been falling since morning, mixing with the tears of those who had come to say a true goodbye to Elijah. There were many such people: his former students, now accomplished jewelers in their own right, colleagues who had worked shoulder to shoulder with him for decades, old friends of our family. Marcus and Tanisha stood at the coffin, performing universal grief. Tanisha, dressed in an elegant black gown by a noted designer, held a lace handkerchief to her eyes with practiced sorrow. Marcus, in his expensive suit, furrowed his brow and pressed his lips together mournfully. They played their roles flawlessly. Anyone who didn't know them might have thought these were the most heartbroken children in the world. I stood slightly apart, beside Calvin. I wasn't crying. My tears had run out the night Elijah left me. Inside was only a cold, scorched emptiness and an iron resolve to see our plan through to the end. At the graveside, when the coffin was ready to be committed, the pastor invited the family to cast a handful of earth onto the lid, an old tradition. I stepped up first, took the cold, wet soil in my palm, whispered, "Goodbye, my love," and let it fall. Marcus went next. He tossed the earth too, but awkwardly, hurriedly, as if afraid of getting his expensive shoes dirty. Then Tanisha stepped forward. She scooped up a full fistful of earth, but instead of casting it into the grave, she spun sharply toward me. Her face was twisted with fury, her eyes blazing. "Your place is in that grave right beside him, you old witch," she hissed, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. And with those words, she flung the wet, dirty earth into my face. For a moment, total silence fell. Everyone froze, stunned by the outrage. Earth hit my cheek, my coat, a few grains found my eyes. I looked at my son. I searched his eyes for support, but Marcus simply turned away. He pretended nothing had happened. He said not a word, not one. He betrayed me, utterly and completely, in the most terrible, most defenseless moment of my life. Something broke inside me, that last thin thread still connecting me to him, to my son, snapped with the sound of a breaking string. I slowly, calmly reached into my pocket and wiped the dirt from my face with my handkerchief. I did not cry out. I did not weep. I simply looked at Tanisha directly into her eyes, and there must have been something in my gaze that made her step back. There was no pain in it. There was steel. Calvin came to me and took my arm. "Cal, it's all right," I said quietly. "Everything is going to plan." The people around us began to murmur. Some shook their heads reproachfully at Tanisha. Others looked at me with sympathy. The scene my daughter-in-law had staged had turned against her. She had wanted to humiliate me, and instead she had disgraced herself. I stood quietly through the rest of the ceremony. I watched the workers lower the heavy oak coffin, the empty coffin, into the earth, and I thought, today I buried not only my husband, today I buried my son as well. The boy I had loved was gone. What remained was this strange, spineless man who had let his wife throw a fistful of cemetery dirt into his own mother's face. Walking back from the cemetery, I knew there was no more dilemma before me, no more doubt, no more pity. There was only my husband's last wish, and I would carry it out with a cold and clean conscience. The day after the funeral, Calvin's office was full. Beside myself, Marcus and Tanisha, there were 2 representatives of the Rising Star Foundation, a children's charity Elijah had supported for many years. Their presence was an unpleasant surprise for Marcus and Tanisha. They sat in their chairs, taut as wire, shooting hostile glances my way. Calvin, his expression unreadable, put on his glasses and opened the sealed envelope. "We are here," he said, his voice ringing with particular weight in the silence, "to read the last will and testament of Elijah James Washington." He began to read. First came the standard language of sound mind and body, then the provisions concerning the property, the house, the studio, the bank accounts. All of it, according to the will, passed to me, his lawful wife. I watched Marcus's face turn dark red. Tanisha clenched her fists until her knuckles went white. "What about the son?" Marcus gritted out. "Did he leave me nothing?" "Patience," Calvin said calmly, turning the page. "Now for the main matter, the collection." He paused and swept the room with a heavy look. Quote, "My collection of rough diamonds gathered over a lifetime," he began reading Elijah's words, "I bequeath to be buried with me." Dead silence fell over the office. Marcus and Tanisha sat with their mouths open. The representatives of the foundation exchanged puzzled glances. "Buried?" Marcus was the first to find his voice. He lost his mind." "Please do not interrupt," the attorney said sharply, and continued. Quote, "I wish for my stones, my soul, to rest with me. However, I understand this decision may seem eccentric, and so I leave one condition." He paused again, and I could see a gleam of avarice kindle in Marcus and Tanisha's eyes. Quote, "Exactly 1 week after my burial, my casket shall be exhumed in the presence of my attorney, my wife Dorothy, my son Marcus, and representatives of the Rising Star Foundation. Whatever the casket contains, namely the diamond collection, shall pass to whichever of my loved ones has, during that week, proven genuine devotion to my memory and selfless love for my life's work. The degree of that devotion shall be assessed by my executor and friend, Attorney Calvin." Marcus and Tanisha exhaled with relief. The calculators in their heads were already running. This was a quest, a game with an entire fortune as the prize. Quote, "If, however, upon the conclusion of that week, my executor concludes that none of my family members showed fitting respect and mourning, but were guided solely by a hunger for gain, the entire diamond collection shall be transferred to the Rising Star Foundation for the care of children." "That's brilliant," Tanisha whispered, nudging Marcus. "So we just need to show that we're grieving?" asked Marcus. "You need to demonstrate devotion to your father's memory," Calvin corrected him without blinking. "You have 1 week." When we stepped outside, Marcus and Tanisha were no longer paying the slightest attention to me. They were whispering excitedly, already making plans. I caught fragments. "We'll hold a memorial evening, invite all his business contacts. We need to give an interview to the paper." They had taken the bait. They had swallowed the hook without noticing it, so blinded by their greed that they hadn't even stopped to ask the one essential question: why would Elijah, a practical man not prone to theatrical gestures, need any of this elaborate theater? I walked down the street, breathing in the fresh Atlanta air, and for the first time in many days, I smiled. Not happily, no, the way a chess player smiles when they have set a beautiful, inescapable checkmate. The week Elijah had allotted became theater of the absurd, with my son and his wife as the lead actors. They mounted such a furious campaign of commemorating the dead that I am certain my late husband was laughing until tears ran down his heavenly cheeks. Their first move was an extravagant memorial dinner at the finest restaurant in the city. Every person who had ever been connected to Elijah was invited: longtime clients, business partners, even a couple of city officials. I was, of course, invited too, and seated at the head of the table. Marcus rose and delivered a speech with a tragic expression. He spoke of what a great man his father had been, of how much Elijah had contributed to the art of jewelry, of how deeply he himself was suffering the loss. He spoke with such hollow pomposity that my jaw ached. I could see Elijah's old friends struggling to suppress smiles. Tanisha fluttered between the guests in a modest but extravagantly expensive black dress, topping up glasses and looking earnestly into people's eyes, telling everyone how she and Marcus planned to carry on Elijah's legacy, open a museum in his name, and establish an award for young talent. The next day, the city's main paper ran a piece under the headline, "In Memory of a Great Master." It featured an interview with a grief-stricken son sharing childhood memories of his father. The memories were fabricated almost entirely from start to finish. According to Marcus, he had dreamed since boyhood of following in his father's footsteps, had spent all his time in the studio, had even helped with stone cutting. In reality, the only thing that had ever interested Marcus in that studio was how much any particular stone was worth. They arranged daily prayer services at church, donated a sizable sum to an animal shelter, which they naturally announced on social media. They even made a cemetery visit with a photographer to capture their grief at the fresh grave on film. Every step was a carefully calculated public relations move. They were not mourning, they were accumulating points, performing for an audience whose most important member they believed to be Attorney Calvin. I spent that week in silence. I went nowhere, saw no one. I went through Elijah's archive, his sketches, his technical drawings, his working notes. It was an entire universe. I read his marginalia, his reflections on form, on light, on the soul of a stone. I touched his tools, each one an extension of his hands. That was my farewell, my true honoring of his memory. I did not wear my mourning for display. My mourning was inside, in my heart, and it was real, unlike their carnival of vanity. One evening, Calvin stopped by. He looked tired. "What a circus they're running," he sighed, settling into the armchair. "They call me every day with reports on their good deeds. Marcus showed up yesterday with a folder of newspaper clippings as evidence of filial love." "What do you tell them?" "I tell them I'm taking note," he said with a dry smile. "Let them keep at it. The harder they work, the more foolish they'll look at the end." He gave me a long look. "How are you holding up?" "I'm holding. I know what all this is for." "Good," he patted my hand. "Elijah would be proud of you. You're the real thing." His words gave me strength. I knew the ending was nearly here. The final day of the week, Marcus and Tanisha decided to go out in style. They announced they were making an inaugural contribution to the creation of the Elijah Museum. The sum was substantial. I knew they didn't have that money. In all likelihood, they had taken yet another loan, utterly convinced they would cover it within days and have plenty left over. They were so certain of their victory, so blinded by the glitter of diamonds they believed were already in their hands. And that was the most beautiful thing about my husband's plan. He had turned their own chief weapon against them, their bottomless, all-consuming greed. They were digging their own grave with their own hands, and all I had to do was wait for them to fall into it with a crash. The night before the exhumation, I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen, drinking cold tea and remembering. I remembered the day Elijah first shared his wild plan with me. It was about a month before he passed. He was already very weak, barely able to get out of bed, but his eyes burned with the same old eagerness. "Dorothy," he said, taking my hand, "I want your advice, jeweler to gemologist, about my final piece. I want to create something perfect, not an ornament, a performance, a drama in one act with elements of farce. The lead characters, our son and his charming wife. I hadn't understood what he meant. He told me everything with a grin. The will, the buried diamonds, the exhumation. Have you lost your mind? That's sacrilege! Sacrilege, my dear, he said seriously, is living the way our son has lived. Sacrilege is trading away a parent's love for the shine of money. I don't want them to have my stones. They don't deserve them. They'll reduce them to dust, tasteless trinkets, expensive cars and clothes. I want my stones to serve something greater or belong to no one. I looked at him, at my wise, exhausted husband, and I understood. He was not a cruel man, but he was a just one, and he wanted to give them one last lesson. But how? How do we do it? That's exactly where I need your help. His eyes glinted slyly. Yours and our old friend Cal's. The plan was simple and audacious. The evening before the funeral, late at night, after the viewing room was empty, we would make the switch. Calvin had arranged things with an acquaintance, the director of the funeral home. For a respectable sum, the man agreed to disable the cameras for half an hour and see nothing. And now I relived that night in memory. We pulled up to the funeral home in Calvin's car. In the trunk lay an identical oak casket, absolutely the same, but empty. 2 solid employees, who Calvin had also paid for their silence, helped us. We entered the viewing room. In the center, on its stand, was the casket with my Elijah. "Forgive me, my love," I whispered, placing my hand on the cold, polished wood. The switch took less than 10 minutes. We moved Elijah's body into the empty casket, and the one intended for the burial was left on the stand. Into it, per his instructions, we placed only one small velvet pillow. The true casket with my husband went to the crematorium, which Calvin had also arranged. Elijah had always wanted to be cremated. He used to say, "I worked with fire my whole life. Let fire be my final resting place." Calvin collected the urn the following day and promised to keep it in his safe until everything was finished. Everything was done quickly, cleanly, without witnesses. When we returned home, I felt completely emptied, but I knew I had done everything right. I had honored my husband's wishes. And now, sitting in the kitchen in the pre-dawn dark, I was waiting for the finale of this performance. I put on a simple but elegant gray dress. I didn't want to look like a victim or a victor. I wanted to look as a great craftsman's widow should look, come to honor his memory and his last, most brilliant joke. The day of the exhumation dawned surprisingly sunny. A bright, cold autumn sun flooded the cemetery, making the dewdrops on the yellowed grass glitter. That sunny clarity seemed almost inappropriate against the backdrop of what was about to happen. I arrived with Calvin. Marcus and Tanisha were already there. They stood at the graveside with expressions of poorly concealed triumph. Tanisha wore a light cashmere coat. A faint smile played on her lips. Marcus looked solid and confident. He was even nodding at the workers proprietarily, as if directing their preparations. A little ways off stood 2 men from the Rising Star Foundation. Their faces were grave and sad. They, unlike my family, were genuinely hoping for a miracle. Journalists had arrived too, a young woman from the local paper and a cameraman. Marcus and Tanisha had clearly made sure their triumph would be preserved for history. At exactly 10 o'clock, Calvin drew the will from his briefcase and declared loudly, In accordance with the final wishes of the late Elijah James Washington, we proceed with the exhumation in order to determine the disposition of his collection. The workers took up their shovels. Earth flew aside. Marcus and Tanisha pressed forward. Their eyes were fixed on the opening grave. They weren't looking at me. I had ceased to exist for them. I was already the written-off past. I stood with my hands folded calmly. Inside me was neither excitement nor spite, only a cold, detached sadness. I looked at my son, at his greedy, impatient face, and thought, "Did you really understand nothing, my boy?" At last the shovel struck something solid. "There!" one of the workers called out. The casket was carefully uncovered, lifted by ropes, slowly and gently brought to the surface. Marcus surged forward as if he wanted to jump into the pit himself and help. Tanisha took out her phone, apparently to film the historic moment. The heavy oak casket was set on the ground beside the grave. The workers began unscrewing the lid. In the silence that had fallen, the creak of each screw seemed deafening. "And so," Calvin said with ceremony when the last screw was out, "I ask all present to bear witness." He stepped forward and, together with the workers, lifted the heavy lid. Marcus and Tanisha shoved past everyone, leaned over the casket, looked inside, and froze. Their faces transformed in an instant beyond recognition. Confidence became bewilderment, bewilderment became confusion, and confusion became horror. The casket was empty, completely empty. No diamonds, no body, nothing. Only on the bottom, against the white satin lining, lay a small velvet pillow, and on the pillow, a note. Calvin leaned down, picked up the note, and read it aloud, slowly and clearly. "Those who seek only stones shall receive only earth." At that moment, Tanisha made a strange, strangled sound, half sob, half wail. She sank slowly to the ground. Marcus stood as if struck by lightning. His face was white as chalk. The journalist lowered her microphone in confusion. The cameraman kept filming, no longer sure whether he was recording tragedy or farce. The foundation representatives exchanged glances. In their eyes was not disappointment, but something closer to amazement, mixed with respect for the final joke of an old jeweler. And I simply stood and looked at the sky, bright, blue, and bottomless, and it seemed to me that somewhere up there, very high, my Elijah was looking down at us and laughing, laughing at human foolishness and human greed. The show was over. Curtain. Marcus was the first to break out of his stupor. "What does this mean?" he shouted, whirling on Calvin. "Where are the stones? Where is my father's body? This is a mistake." "There is no mistake," the attorney said calmly. "Everything is exactly in accordance with the deceased's wishes. The contents of the casket, as you can see, are absent. But the will said the contents would pass to the worthiest. If there is no contents, there is nothing to distribute." Tanisha, who had been helped back to her feet, grabbed her husband's sleeve. "Marcus, he tricked us," she was shrieking. "That old man made fools of us, and you—" she jabbed a finger in my direction. "You knew. You were in on it from the start." I looked at her in silence. I didn't even want to answer. Her hysteria was the finest proof of her smallness. Back in Calvin's office, the atmosphere was businesslike. Marcus and Tanisha sat slumped like children called before the principal. "Let us summarize," Calvin said, putting on his glasses. "The primary asset of the estate, the diamond collection, is at this time considered unlocated. The conditions set by the testator have been satisfied by none of the claimants." "What do you mean, not satisfied?" Tanisha erupted. "We spent an entire week—" "Your activities, the attorney said coldly, cutting her off, were assessed by me not as genuine expressions of grief, but as a well-staged performance designed to produce financial gain. Elijah was a perceptive man and left me clear instructions to that effect. He drew another envelope from his folder. This is a codicil to the will. It states that in the event his family members were guided not by feeling, but by self-interest, all remaining estate assets, the house, the studio, the bank accounts, pass to the full and sole authority of his lawful wife, Dorothy Washington. If a bomb had gone off in the office at that moment, it would have caused less shock. Marcus jumped to his feet, knocking over his chair. All of it to her? I'm his son. I have a right to a forced share. You do not, Calvin said crisply. You are an able-bodied man of 48. You are not disabled, and you were not a dependent of your father. The law stands with your mother. Tanisha stared at me with wide-open eyes full of hatred. You planned all of this. You knew from the beginning the casket was empty. I simply carried out the last wishes of my husband, I answered calmly, which is what I would wish for you, to learn to do your duty rather than simply demanding your rights. It was the end, complete and crushing. They left the office without a goodbye, slamming the door behind them. The representatives of the foundation shook my hand. We are in awe of your husband's wisdom, Dorothy. Justice matters more than any gift. When I was alone with Calvin, he poured me a glass of water. Well then, my friend, congratulations. We won, Cal, I corrected him. I couldn't have done it without you. Nonsense, he said, waving it off. I simply honored a friend's request. What will you do now with all of this? I looked out the window. The cold autumn sun of Atlanta was still shining on the street outside. I don't want Elijah's legacy to turn into just a number in a bank account. It needs to live the way he would have wanted it to. That evening, for the first time in many days, I took the bag of diamonds from the safety deposit box. I spread them on the velvet cloth on the studio work table. They glimmered dully in the lamplight, holding within their facets millions of years of the Earth's history. They were cold, but I felt a warmth rising from them, the warmth of my husband's hands. And I understood. He had not left me merely stones. He had left me a mission. The consequences for Marcus and Tanisha were catastrophic. Their public humiliation at the graveside, captured by journalists, spread through the whole city within days. The article ran under the sardonic headline, "Heirs at an Empty Grave, an Atlanta Drama with Elements of Farce." An avalanche of contempt descended on them. Old acquaintances stopped greeting them on the street. Business partners terminated every contract. The bank, learning that their inheritance had come to nothing, demanded immediate repayment of their loans. They were left with nothing, no money, no reputation, no future. For the first several weeks, they kept calling me. Tanisha was first, screaming into the phone, threatening legal action. I listened in silence and set the receiver down. Then Marcus started calling. "Mom, how could this happen?" he whined. "We're your family. We'll be destroyed." "You are no longer my family, Marcus," I answered coldly. "My family ended the day you turned away while your wife threw cemetery dirt in my face." A month later, they arrived at my door. Marcus practically fell through it. They looked terrible. Tanisha had lost weight, grown haggard. Not a trace of her former polish remained. Marcus was unshaven, his eyes red from sleeplessness. "Mom, give us money. We have nothing to eat." "I will not give you 1 cent, I said, folding my arms. "But why?" Tanisha wailed. "You have millions now." "You don't exist for me. You died in me along with my love and my trust." They understood I was not joking. The wall they had built between us themselves was impenetrable. "You'll regret this," Marcus hissed as he left. "You'll be old and alone with no one." "I'm not alone. I have my husband's work and his memory. That is more than either of you ever had." I threw myself into realizing the plan. First, I sold several of the largest diamonds from Elijah's collection. The sum was enormous, but I looked at that money without any trembling. It was a tool for building something new. I found an old abandoned building in the historic Sweet Auburn district, a former mansion from the Reconstruction era. It was in terrible shape, but as a gemologist, I know how to see hidden beauty where others see only ruin. I bought it. The next 6 months were spent on renovation and restoration. I hired the finest architectural conservators. We restored the old plasterwork, uncovered the oak parquet, returned the building to its original face. Inside, we fitted modern jewelry workshops, lecture halls, a small library. My vision was simple. I didn't want to create merely a museum, but a living working space, a place where young, talented people from across the country could study the art of jewelry making at no cost, a place where the traditions Elijah had established would be honored and carried forward. I named the place the Elijah Washington School of Jewelry Arts. During all that time, I never once saw Marcus or Tanisha. I heard through acquaintances that they had sold their apartment to pay off their debts and left the city. Marcus had taken a job as a security guard at a grocery store. Their beautiful life had ended before it ever really began. I had no concern to spare for them. I was consumed by my new creation. I watched something large and important being born before my eyes, something that would outlast me, and that filled my life with a kind of meaning I had never felt before. The grand opening of the Elijah Washington School took place exactly 1 year after his death, on the very same day. Many people came. The mayor, celebrated jewelers, art scholars, journalists. I stood on the steps of the restored mansion, cut the red ribbon, and gave a speech. I spoke of my husband, of his talent, of his dream. I spoke of how true wealth is not the stones in a safe, but the knowledge and craft we pass to others. In one of the galleries, I mounted an exhibition of Elijah's work. People stood at the cases, and I saw genuine wonder in their eyes. My husband's name was sounding again, not in a scandal column, but in the context of high art and a noble purpose. That evening, when the guests had gone, I stayed in the building alone. I walked the echoing corridors, looked into the empty workshops. Tomorrow, the first students would arrive. 10 talented young people selected by competition from across the country. Tomorrow, this place would come alive. I went to the large window in the main hall. Outside, a light winter rain was falling, the kind Atlanta gets in January. Mist over the old streets, the soft light of lamp posts. Suddenly, I spotted a familiar figure across the street. A man in a simple, worn coat stood under a lamppost looking at the lit windows of my school. It was Marcus. He stood there a long time, motionless, just looking. I didn't know what he felt, remorse, envy, or simply emptiness. He made no move to approach, made no attempt to call. He just stood and looked. Then he turned and walked slowly away, dissolving into the rainy Atlanta mist. I didn't call out to him. I just watched him go, and in that moment I understood that I had forgiven him. No, I hadn't forgotten anything. Betrayal cannot be forgotten. But the searing pain was gone. What remained was only a quiet, luminous sadness for the way things could have been, but weren't. I turned away from the window. Part of the diamond collection I gave, as Elijah had directed in his will, to the Rising Star Foundation. I knew he would be glad. The remaining stones rested in the safe, but I no longer saw them as mere treasure. To me, they had become a symbol of how love and memory are stronger than greed, that the true legacy is not measured in carats, but in what remains in the hearts of people. I found a new family, my students, my colleagues, my kindred spirits. I found new meaning, and I was endlessly grateful to my wise, unpredictable Elijah for his last, most brilliant lesson. He didn't simply punish the unworthy, he gave me a new life. Thank you for staying with my story. It was a hard one, but I hope it gives someone the strength to believe in themselves and in justice. Remember, even after the darkest night, dawn always comes. The key is to wait for it and not be afraid to take the first step toward a new day. Hold tight to those who truly love you.